Fourth installment of the FA1 Learning Series webinars. My name is Sonia Guerriero, and I'm a program specialist in the section of education policy at UNESCO. Today's webinar is a joint session with the OECD and will explore how research evidence can be used to improve educational policies and learning outcomes. I will hand over the opening to our director for the Division of Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems, Mr. Boran Shakroum. You may go ahead, Boran.
Thank you, Sonia, and very good afternoon, good morning, good evening, maybe to some of the colleagues who are joining us today. As Sonia mentioned, this is a very important session that we are considering today to look at how research evidence can be used in designing more effective policy solutions. And your discussion today and our focus today really echoes with the global education meeting we organized a few weeks ago in Fortaleza in Brazil, where we adopted the Fortaleza Declaration that really focuses on how important for us to advance the implementation of the policies in hand, how to address the challenge that we are facing in education, particularly in achieving SDG 4, and how we leverage the data for it, including aspects related to the gaps in financing of education and the quality of education more broadly. So the Fortaleza Declaration, as we are calling it, it calls for reinforcement of participatory and democratic governance in education at our level by strengthening the system capacity for evidence-based policy making, planning, and management. It's also about a capacity to plan, collect, and analyze education data and learning data to ensure accountability and transparency in educational governance and resource allocation. The declaration also calls for the improvement in the governance of financing of education by ensuring transparent and evidence-based allocation and use of these data resources. Maybe you know that we are lacking $100 billion per year to achieve SDG 4. So the question of mobilization of additional resources, equitable use of resources, but also efficient use of these resources is something that is very important for us to consider. But all this in our discussion today has to be framed within this context of what we tend to call a learning crisis. And I think most of colleagues know about the data, the global data that we published a few weeks ago. We have still more than 250 million children and youth who are out of school. We know that we have more than 33% of students in the poorest countries that are not in school at all. And even when students access to education, the learning outcomes is lacking. And I'm sure you'll be discussing this, but from the data we are collecting from the work, the colleagues at the World Bank, UNICEF, ourselves, and OECD colleagues, we know that around 70% of the children at age 10 in low and middle income countries are not able to read and understand a simple sentence. So this calls for a major, I would say, transformation of education, and particularly how we can leverage data and evidence to support an effective implementation of the policies. And this is something that we have been highlighting, and many of the research and analysis obviously it's not something new, but it's something that is getting more attention, is how far we are leveraging the data and evidence for decision making. What data is available, how we are using this data. I think you can refer, for example, to a recent review from NORAG that revealed that while research generates a wealth of data and evidence in education, its uptake in policy making, planning, and implementation remains limited in many countries. It's also something that our work in the Global Monitoring Report has highlighted, and I will come back to that. But what NORAG colleagues have identified is two challenges or two broken feedback loops. One between researchers and policymakers, and the second between global and local levels, how we leverage the global data and how we enter this interplays with the local evidence and data. Probably one thing that is important is that it's not only about the what, meaning what data is collected and what data is needed for decision making, is also how it is used. And the Global Monitoring Report speaks about the education leadership and sometimes the challenges of advancing education leadership. And the report shows that even if data is available, the capacities of the leadership to use it, to engage in a social dialogue with teachers, representatives, with parents, with the wider public, is something that is missing. And that impacts the leadership capacity to move from design to implementation of the policies. So I would like to, in a way, to highlight that there is an issue of data collection, data use, and the quality of the data and the efficient use of it. But I would like also to insist about the change management that should happen through the leadership of the leaders, but also through the social dialogue. That is something that is very important in the work we are doing. So colleagues, what should we expect today, and what you should expect in this session that we are organizing today together with our colleagues at OECD? One, of course, we are looking for improving the capacity of education authorities through this peer learning and cooperation and knowledge sharing. We would like also to increase the understanding of the accessibility of local relevant research and evidence, and how to build the bridges between what we know at the local level and what we know from a global level, and the knowledge that is generated. And of course, it's about advocacy and a call to member states, to stakeholders, for a much more engagement with data and evidence. Sonia just mentioned that this is the fourth session, and before that we had three other webinars. The first was organized with the UNESCO's International Institute for Education Planning, which explored the use of evidence on conducting effective situational analysis. The second was, again, with the collaboration with the Institute for Education Planning, which explored how to use data and evidence for costing and implementation of effective policy plans. And the third was in collaboration with UNESCO's multi-sectorial regional office in Dakar, which explored how in Senegal data and evidence are being used to offer new insights and ideas of contemporary education issues to inform the second continental education strategy for Africa, and focus on SDG 4 and the CESA collaboration. So today we have the pleasure to have a representative from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire who will share with us their experience on education evidence labs. And we have also the pleasure to have colleagues from Ireland and Netherlands who will share their experience of participating at the OECD project on strengthening the impact of education research. So I wish you all a successful learning experience, and for all of us to engage for improving the impact of data and evidence in education policy design and implementation. Over to you, Sonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boren. That was a very inspiring opening for our following session. Over to you, Andreas. You are welcome to give your opening.
Thank you, Sonia, but the screen is still sharing, has not been made available. If you could do that.
Yes. Jose Manuel, can you support Andreas to share his screen?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Jose Manuel?
Yeah, I hear you. Andreas, I can share the screen for you if you want.
No, you just need to enable screen sharing for me, then I can use my slides.
Great.
Make me co-host or something like that.
You're already co-host.
No, I'm not. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm a participant at the moment.
Going now. All yours.
Good. Yeah, now it seems to work. Thank you so much. And it's another great opportunity to collaborate with UNESCO. I think this is a mission that we really share to get both policy and also practice, greater buy-in into the evidence that we have on education. And I just want to start with two simple images. On this, you see on the vertical axis, the academic success of education systems, and on the horizontal axis, the money that is spent per student. And you can see, yeah, at the beginning, there's a strong relationship, for countries spending very little, investing more, gets better outcomes. But there comes a point when the relationship between investment and outcomes is actually quite weak. You can see, for example, the United States spends about 10 times as much as Vietnam per student and gets pretty much the same result. So money is important, but not sufficient. You can see the same when you actually look at the volume of learning time. Here you can see the hours students spend learning in school and the hours they spend learning out of school. And you can see vast differences across countries. Now, Morocco, students learn close to 50 hours per week. In Switzerland, it's less than 30 hours. Now, but once again, when you look at productivity in education, you can see in Switzerland, students learn a lot in very little time. In Morocco, students spend a lot of time learning and learn actually quite little. So what these data show is that some of the relationship between the resources and outcomes are quite complex. We need to better understand it, to give policymakers good advice on how to leverage outcomes, improve the effectiveness of resource utilization. And that's really what our Center for Educational Research and Innovation, CERI, is working on. Traditionally, we have just broadcasted what we know. We have data and we send them out, we publish them, and then we think, people will change their minds and attitudes. That doesn't happen. Teachers will not change their behavior simply because a report has been published. Policymakers will not take action just because some data are out. We understand that a lot really is relational. Building strong interlinkages, relationships between the users and providers of information so that the providers focus evidence and data on what the practitioners and the policymakers need. And at the same time, policymakers and practitioners have the capacity to leverage, to utilize knowledge. And that is very, very important. But what we increasingly understand, even that relational method of knowledge mobilization is not sufficient. We really need to take a systemic approach where there are good incentives for people to continue to learn, to open their mind, to try alternatives, where there's good research infrastructure that builds those kinds of linkages, and where there is good leadership. A lot depends, on the value that is being attached to evidence. Do practitioners, teachers in the classroom, believe that research can, transform their practice? Do they believe teaching is an art or is teaching a science? That has a lot to do with leadership that establishes the kind of evidence culture, the collaborative culture that you need to make this work. So those three components are really, really important. Let me share you some data, and some of that is quite concerning when you actually look at the extent to which policymakers use education research. They use it a lot to, identify problems, deficiencies in the system. That's the first thing that you see when data show you when something is wrong. They use it to design policies, programs, projects, and reforms. But when you look, one bar down, formulating legislation, regulation, guidelines, the bars get much lower. And then, leveraging political influence in policy decision-making. Now, that's about the political economy, the stakeholder dynamics. So they're really difficult issues. You can see that's still based on, accommodating interests rather than, basing this on evidence and data. So you can really see there's a lot that we need to do to advance, to make sure that those bars get longer in this chart. I also, want to look at the culture that supports research use. The SERI study looked at this in quite detail, and the motivation is there. No? And education systems responded positively that they use education research in their process and that this is important for policy, well understood. Policymakers are expected to use education research in their processes, well understood. No? But, when you get to the next layer, the willingness of people to try new ways to integrate education research, you're down to 60%. Policymakers willing to learn new skills for using education research, down to 60%. So that's where you can see the challenges, the capacity, willingness to do that. And then the quality of relationships. There's a high level of trust in research amongst policymakers. You're almost down to half. There's a high level of trust between policymakers and researchers, people who do that research. Also, that is not great. And policymakers and researchers have a shared understanding of education research and how it's to be used. You're below 50%. So you can really see a lot really that we are talking about is establishing more of a culture that evidence is something that is an integral part of decision-making, that we have the training and capacity now. Boren, you already touched on, the policymakers have the necessary skills. You can see research literacy. Two-thirds say yes, evaluate the quality of education research, understand and interpret research, but, one-third does not. And you can see, on the research use, bars get even shorter. Communicate research for their peers. There's a lot of skills that we need to develop. Sometimes it's also a responsibility of the researchers themselves to make their work better understandable, better focused on the users. A lot of papers are quite complex and very difficult to understand for someone who doesn't have the methodological background. There's a communication challenge often on both sides of that equation. So what we need to ensure is to ensure that the quality and effectiveness of brokerage effort, the intermediaries who, make sure that there are effective links between what we know and what we do, are sustained and that they are improved. Sometimes this is well done by brokerage institutions. There are many countries that are setting up, specialized institutions that do nothing else than, just make sure that what we know gets to those who need to base decisions on this. But it's also important to scale up effective knowledge mobilization initiatives to increase outreach and interactions with more of the stakeholders that can make a difference. Often those kinds of linkages are still quite limited, and also to improve the methodologies, the processes of brokerage to increase the efficiency of research use. So these are just a few pointers of areas where we should, advance the agenda, where there is a lot to do. We know a lot, it's not that there is a shortage of research. There is in some areas, but there's a lot of information that is available that we know. There are people willing to use it, policymakers who'd like to base that, but, the linkages between those still need to be reinforced, improved, and the same is true for research and practice. Thank you, and I look forward to see the outcomes from this event.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Very interesting findings. We will now move to hearing the presentations from our 4 invited speakers. We will begin with Kwame Akiampong. He is Professor of International Education and Development at the Open University in the UK. And he also chairs the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which was convened by the World Bank, UNICEF, USAID, and the UK government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Thank you, Kwame, for joining us. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you see my screen?
We see your screen, but we don't see you.
Can you see me now?
Yes, and you can also put your presentation on full presentation mode if you want.
Where do I do that?
You click the there's an icon at the very bottom. The icon at just at the very end of the 4 icons at the very bottom, just before the minus sign. I think that puts it in full presentation mode. No, we lost your slides now.
Can it be shared from your end? I'm having a bit trouble here.
Yes, we can share them for you, don't worry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for the challenge with getting my slides up. What I'm going to share very briefly is about the process that was undertaken in Ghana to set up an educational lab and some of the issues that we grappled with in that process. So the educational lab in Ghana we've called it the Ghana Education Evidence and Data Lab. And this presentation just gives you an overview of the process and some of the challenges and issues that arose as we set up the lab. Next slide. So why was there a need for what we call a GID lab in Ghana? And I think this is quite typical of many countries in low-income countries, particularly in Africa. And in Ghana, we found that there wasn't a platform where we can consolidate education research, evidence, and data in one place in the ministry for it to be accessed very rapidly and to inform decision-making. So there was, if you went into the ministry or you went to the Ghana Education Service, you could not find a place where you could say, okay, what's the latest evidence that is coming? How do policymakers access this? We also found that research findings are often scattered and mostly paper-based. Multiple sources of education data are emerging, but they are not being consolidated. And so we are not avoiding fragmentation and duplication of education data and research evidence. There are about, I would say, 10 to 12 organizations that hold education data in Ghana, and they compete, they don't speak to each other. And often the problem is that they are also funded by international organizations, and none of those departments want to lose their responsibility for hosting some of this data because it comes with resources. So you have a lot of data in the system, but we don't have consolidation. So the GID lab was to address this issue. Next slide, please. So we wanted to answer 3 main areas of interest. So we have multiple interventions in Ghana. If you it's unfortunately or fortunately, it's one of those countries where there's a lot of research going on by multiple players. But there's very little clarity on what works and why, for whom, and which can be scaled up at costs that are affordable. So when we interviewed the Ministry of Education's policymakers, they just couldn't cite clearly what's the corpus of evidence that was coming from the multiple interventions that were out there. So it wasn't that there weren't interventions or research that is out there. It's just that nobody knew exactly what they should pay attention to. So we also didn't have, we didn't know which education interventions and programs are delivering improved learning outcomes that can be scaled up at affordable costs. I think for the policymakers, it's not simply the case of evidence. Education budgets are very tight. And so if you have an intervention that says, we can improve learning and it costs $1,000 a child to do it, obviously the policymakers are saying we cannot do this. So we also realize this is an issue that there is of a gap. The third point was that to get the education evidence and data into policymakers and administrators and teachers was also central. How do you actually do that efficiently? So when we ask people in the ministry, we ask people, how do you get access to evidence or data? It just didn't, either there's some report and somebody shares with them, or there's a forum where this is presented. There wasn't a systematic way in which they could access this data or evidence to make decision making. Next slide, please. So I'll share very briefly the architecture of the evidence lab. So what was decided was that they would put the evidence lab within the Ministry of Education in a division called the Statistics, Research and Information Management Unit, which already exists. The emphasis for the EdLab in Ghana was to strengthen the structures that already exist. So the issue was not that we were not having evidence. Like I said, there was a lot of evidence research interventions, but we wanted to find a systematic way of making this accessible. So the stream is quite key to the EdLab. And out of this stream, the ministry has set up what we call a high-level evidence committee. So this high-level evidence committee is fed with information, data on critical issues that have been defined in in Ghana, what we are calling a research and learning agenda, so that they can really consider this evidence and make decisions. And then there's also a relationship between a consortium of Ghanaian education researchers and the stream. So there's a relationship between the researchers in Ghana, the local researchers, the stream, which is within the ministry, and the high-level evidence steering committee, which is there to consider this the evidence. So a lot of effort has gone into creating these structures to ensure that evidence can reach decision makers. Next slide, please. So part of the process of setting the evidence lab was also to do a systematic review. And here I will just highlight a few things that came from the research that has been done in Ghana in the past 20 years or so. And we did a synthesis of that. And we saw that there is quite limited rigorous studies. There's several studies, but not many of them are very rigorous, which are aimed at improving literacy and numeracy outcomes in Ghana. But I think the second point is what I want to highlight, is that although we have well-implemented interventions to improve children's literacy and numeracy outcomes in the short term, the research has not looked at it in terms of the long-term impact. So we don't know much of that. And this was important for us to understand. Many of these interventions and the research that are based on them are quite short-term. So we don't know what happens in the long term. In fact, a few of them where we looked at the long-term impact, we realized that those impacts have kind of fizzled out with time. And then we also found there was very little cost data that is collected, like I said earlier on. And then finally, technology-based interventions have not been implemented and assessed at scale. Next slide. We also wanted to talk to teachers. I think sometimes we think we have the answers about what teachers need. And so we did a national survey to find out from teachers what was the biggest, what were the barriers to accessing evidence to improve learning. And many times they said the research information is not easily accessible. You know, when you produce a research report with graphs, and I mean, for the teacher in the classroom, that kind of evidence was not very useful for them. But a third point is what I want to, because we had discussions with the teachers about it. They wanted research information that provides practical steps. So if you say this works, what does that mean for me as a teacher in the classroom? They were not interested in the scientific. They knew it was important, but how do I actually translate this to practice in the classroom? And there's a big gap because there's a lot of research which shows that we have good evidence that is coming about how to improve teaching and learning. And yet teachers are saying that they still have problems with accessing that evidence and to improve classroom teaching and learning. So this has also become a big problem in the ecosystem. And we felt it was very important to listen to the teachers so we get a sense of what the challenges are. Next slide, please. So what we've done in Ghana is to develop a repository, an evidence repository, so that we can pull together the evidence that is floating around into a platform that is accessible by policymakers, teachers, and others who are interested. So this is supposed to be the go-to repository for research and evidence-based materials. So the teachers said they wanted evidence-based materials, not just the evidence. So we are in the process of curating and synthesizing this research into formats. For policymakers, it has to be in formats that they can access, and for teachers, but also for educational administrators. The next slide. So what are the challenges? Before I bring my presentation to an end, I think we have found in the process of developing this evidence lab in Ghana that the problem really is not more better quality evidence. There is good evidence there, but it's only part of the problem. And I think, as Andre said, it is also about how you access, whether there is demand for that evidence. So the knowledge synthesis is a technical process, but we are very sure in the case of Ghana that it will not necessarily improve uptake. If you provide a lot of evidence, there's very little guarantee that this will lead to uptake, even by the policymakers. So we do need to develop a system that motivates and responds to the demand for evidence. I think that's the most important thing. On the one side, we are focusing on the generation of evidence, the systems in place to make sure the evidence is available. But how do we create demand? And in Ghana, what we are trying to do is to use AI to do that. We've been talking to organizations that when we talk to policymakers, we talk to decision makers. They said, well, we want to be able to, type in a question, interrogate, and just get the evidence on Ghana. We don't want to have time to read a report. So we hope that the repository, as we build an AI component to it, would allow policymakers and teachers to easily access this information as and when they need it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aziz. It's nice to hear about the progress. Sorry, not Aziz, comment. It's nice to hear about the progress that you've made. Our next speaker, however, is Aziz. He is the Right Fit Evidence and Policy Manager at Innovations in Poverty Action in the Francophone West Africa. And he is also the coordinator of the Subcommission for Basic Education Literacy of the Local Education Partners Group in Cote d'Ivoire. And today he will speak about his experience with the Education Lab in Cote d'Ivoire. Please go ahead, Aziz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
We can. Yes, it's perfect now.
Great. Thank you so much. Then following the other presenter, I will try to show the case of the Cote d'Ivoire work that we are currently doing, with the goal that is to improve data and evidence use in policy making. Then I think before jumping in more details, I think if I have to share a quick message and something that you have to take from what I will be saying is that first of all, we also in our case realize that data and evidence from research and especially academic work are not every time or in the systematic way used by policymaker or in decision making, despite the fact that those evidence are available and making public. In addition to that, we also think that having a process that allow us to connect the research to the policy needs would be crucial in order to strengthen the culture of data and evidence used. And the last point will be that in the case and the work that we are currently doing with the Ministry of Education in Cote d'Ivoire, we expect that by building a research and learning agenda, improving the political dialogue, and also making sure that there is a better knowledge management of those evidence will also strengthen the culture for using evidence and policy and data for decision making. Then I will start by giving you a bit of background of our context. There is now at the global level, and especially as you can see with these initiatives, there are more and more initiatives to make sure that we have now more evidence policy based. And then in the context of Cote d'Ivoire is also similar to the global context. And especially now, we have faced few years ago a learning crisis. In 2019, we have the PASEC report who showed that kids are not really learning at the end of the primary school. And then that's led the Ministry of Education to conduct what we call the National State of Education, which bring at the top of recommendation the use of evidence and data for doing policy and decision. And also make sure that we have an EMI system to better manage the data that are coming from the old system. And also something that we have to notice is that we currently have in Cote d'Ivoire a law for evaluating policy, public policies since 2022. Then what is the challenge that we are currently facing? In 2022, IPA, as a technical partner of the Ministry of Education, has conducted a capacity assessment to see what are the practice of policymakers or stakeholders within the ecosystem on how they generate the evidence, but also how we use those evidence generated inside the ecosystem. And here I will show you two main criteria that we can discuss. Then the first one, during this capacity assessment, one criteria was to assess if those evidence and data were shared among actors. And then we realized, for instance, that there was a big challenge, and the criteria was assessed in three levels: development, emergency, emerging system, and developed system. And then regarding this criteria of how we share the data among our system, we realized that there is mostly from the bottom to the top, like the directorate will share to the head of the ministry or the minister, or data will be collected from the ground to be sent to the local level, to the central level. But usually it will not do the reverse, like going from the top to the bottom. Like if we finalize to analyze the data, there is no feedback on the ground and those who are currently implementing the policies. And also is not really fluid, is really on ad hoc, like when someone needs the data, or annually basis. For instance, when we conduct the national census on the education system, that we share the data at once, for instance, but is not something that is in the practice. The other criteria that we could also see here is the fact that we'll try also to assess how and if policies are really evidence-based. And we realize that there is an appetite from decision makers to use evidence. But what we also saw is the fact that the type of evidence that they are using is really limited. Either they will only use monitoring evaluation data, and mostly for transparency or accountability, not really for decision making. And I think that's also sounds with what Andreas showed earlier. And then the question that we have is will be, how could we increase the use of those data and evidence, especially also from research work, that will also make sure that will strengthen our policies, especially to resonate these questions with the recommendation of the National State of Education. And then what is the current innovation that the ministry is implementing? As similar to Ghana, the ministry is also implementing a dedicated team who will be supporting this culture. Then they call it the Laboratoire pour l'Éducation. In short word, we call it the EdLab. And this EdLab, le Laboratoire pour l'Éducation, is a priority reform since 2023. As following the Education Conference, then the National State of Education in Cote d'Ivoire. And then IPA is closely working with the Ministry of Education to help in the operationalization of the group of this unit, and making sure that the process on which the EdLab will be working is currently allowing the data and evidence to be connected to the decision making, and those data are included in the decision cycle. And we also have to say that this initiative have been similar to 21 other similar intervention that IPA is also supporting other ministries in the world, and the case of the Cote d'Ivoire is financed by the Jacob Foundation. Then, based on the two criteria and results that I showed earlier, we reach out the point that we need to set up a process which is connecting the data and evidence to the decision cycle, and then how this will happen. And then we design the process using 3 big steps. The first one will be to identify the key policy challenges. And to do so, we build what we call the research and learning agenda. Then we collect from all the directorate implementing program in the ministry, what are the challenges that they are currently facing, for which they think any research, studies, or analytical work will be helping them to solve. And at the same time, we also seek from local researchers what they are already done, so that we could cross the two and see, okay, those are the gaps where there is no evidence, and those are already the parts that local research or global knowledge have already fit. The second step will be to generate the evidence based on the needs. Then for instance, for the needs that are already fed by research that are already done, we could do, I would say, policy briefs or evidence synthesis, those kind of things. For those who are not currently answered, the lab will be generating this research with the support of local researcher and international researcher. And the third step will be to try to find a way to apply those evidence. And then that will go through, first of all, a better management of the knowledge that we have already. We realized, for instance, at one moment that there were a lot of studies that the ministry was involved in, for which they don't even have knowledge of the existence of those research and funding. And then doing a better effort in managing those research findings, and also disseminate those ones with the policymaker, and try to find the policy windows where those findings could be discussed. What would be the third step? As a result from that process, we end up with some key lessons. The first point was the fact that there is opportunities to improve the policy relevance of research, because when the research are not relevant for policymakers, they may not be using this one. The second one is about the challenges. We also realize that there is no permanent dialogue between researchers and policymakers, so that they don't. Andreas mentioned earlier about trust. There is this lack of trust, but also they don't know each other the needs, and the policymaker don't know the needs. The researchers don't know the needs from policymakers, and policymakers don't know what have been already produced. And the third one is to find measures to support the initiative, like financing those research studies, but also making sure that they are we are doing better in terms of knowledge management. And then based on those lessons, there are some recommendations and action that currently have been done. We already talked about the research and learning agenda that have currently been built and endorsed by the ministry to send a signal to researchers on the needs. Regarding the dialogue, currently are trying to set up a consultative committee who will be the scientific committee of the EdLab, and who will also making sure that they have this discussion between policymakers and practitioners and researchers. And the accompanying measure, we are currently trying also to set up a research fund with the ministry and ministry partners to be able to find in the annual budgeting of the ministry, but also for partners, how we could dedicate or allocate funds to finance the research that is based on the ministry needs. But also, we are also trying to set up a research repository based on the research that we were already finding. Then we tried to collect all those studies that were, I will say, hidden in the ministry and also from partners to build this repository, and then for which we expect to be public in the couple of months by the end of the year. Thank you so much. I will stay there for any questions and happy to also learn from your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aziz, for sharing your experience and your lessons learned. Our next speaker is Rian Rao. He is the strategic advisor at the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science. And his presentation is going to be about his current post, where he is leading the Science for Policy project that is exploring new interactions between research and policy. Go ahead, Rian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for the invitation. And I'm going to tell you this afternoon, for me it's afternoon, about the Science for Policy project in the Netherlands that started in the beginning of 2023. It's an exploratory project where, as you said already, and the aim is to look for more dynamic interactions between science and policy, between research and policy. And you must know that in the Netherlands, we already have a kind of rich landscape of brokerage agencies, of science advice institutions, of intermediary institutions. And given that we already have a kind of high developed science advice system, we are looking for ways to improve that, to optimize the working of that. And the idea is that that can only be done in a kind of careful experimental way. So that's what I'm going to talk about, the way we work. The background of starting this project was twofold. One observation from the COVID-19 crisis was that we needed advice from a multidisciplinary perspective. The COVID-19, I think, at least in the Netherlands, but I think this goes worldwide, showed that there was one discipline or maybe two disciplines very dominant in scientific advice, detrimental for other insights. So we really wanted to experiment with multidisciplinary advice. And then another observation was that our current structures, I already said we have a rich landscape, for mediation between policy and science are still too static and linear. So what we want to do in this project, as Andreas showed it, move beyond the linear to the relational and the systemic. And then some lessons from the Ministry of Education itself. We observe that the use of knowledge within our ministry is often fragmented, pragmatic, and specific, using specific sources of knowledge, specific studies, rather than a whole kind of state of play of studies. And the other one was, and I've heard this more before from my colleagues, internal but also external platforms for gathering, discussing, and validating a variety of knowledge sources are lacking within the ministry. So we want to set up those kind of platforms with the scientific community. What we did is, and you can move to the next slide, at the beginning of this year, we have set up a Science for Policy team, as we call it, and which really aims at looking for these new dynamic interactions between science and policy. And maybe most important for us is that this team consists not only of people from the ministry, but also of people from the scientific world, from the scientific institutions like our National Academy, like our National Council for Research, and also from our Association of Universities. So we wanted to have those organizations on board, having really quick and direct contact with the world of science. And good to say is that this team doesn't only work for the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, but this team works across the civil service. So we're doing projects with different ministries. I will tell you some more about what we do. So our first and main strand is exploring new science policy interfaces, as we call them, through example projects. We work with policymakers across the civil service based on the wicked issues that they have to struggle with, where they need kind of insights from a multidisciplinary perspective. We design together with them the interaction mode that is most useful for their development, for their policy development. The projects can take different shapes, just as the involvement of the team can take different shapes, from a very light advisory role to taking full responsibility for preparing and also running meetings between scientists and policymakers. And along the way, we are also looking, so we are organizing meetings. We're also looking to make it more systemic, to see if we can create sustainable new structures for scientific advice. And that's about the first strand. And then the second strand is about strengthening the science policy capacity within ministries and research institutes. We are exploring if we can set up a system for science fellows, which doesn't really exist in the Netherlands. I won't go in detail about that. And the last one is collating and describing models for mapping and interaction. What we observed in our exploration in the first phase is that there's little described precisely what happens in those meetings between scientists and policymakers. So this strand is really about quality assurance of what happens in those meetings. If we're creating new models of interaction, we need the same kind of rigorous quality assurance that now is used in traditional models, like peer review. How do you organize peer review in the kind of flexible dynamic interaction? And it's also, I think, helping to professionalize the brokerage, the intermediation profession, which is coming into existence in itself. I end with some lessons that we've learned so far. I won't go through all of them. I think the first two are quite obvious. We hear them a lot. It takes time to build good connections. Timing is crucial. There needs to be some kind of urgency. What we discovered is that we need to work in multiple speeds. So from a crisis mode to where you really need to organize this interaction within a month or sometimes even faster. And also, and this is about trust, creating trust, is equality and a partnership spirit are crucial. So in our meetings, everyone is an expert, also the policymakers. So there isn't the kind of linear interaction where the scientists provide insights and then the policymakers listen and say how to translate them to their policy. No, they're all experts. So creating this kind of equality and partnership is really essential for our meetings, I think. And then multidisciplinary pays off also for researchers. And it helps to break dominant frames that exist from, so we always start with issues. They are framed sometimes by the media. These meetings really help to get a much more nuanced view and a refined view of what really the issue is and what really the problem is. And what we also experienced is that also scientists have opinions. So what we try to do in these meetings is to explicitly distinguish between opinions from validated claims or facts. Well, will help to, we suppose that helps, we assume that helps really to get evidence closer to policy making. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Rian. This has been very informative, in particular as it's new. So we look forward to hearing more about how it evolves. Our next presentation is a joint presentation by Leonora Harty and Dr. Chiara Loda. Leonora is an assistant principal officer in the Evidence for Policy Unit in the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation, and Science in Ireland, and she is working to support the delivery of evidence-informed policy through enhanced structures for public service engagement with the public research system. And Dr. Chiara Loda is also an assistant principal officer in the same department, and she is responsible for research for education policy relevant to the department. Please go ahead, both of you, Leonora and Chiara. We are a little bit over time, so if you can manage to keep to 10 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm not quite sure if you have the slides there to share. Apologies. Very good. Yeah, thank you so much. And as Sonia mentioned, and just to clarify, so Chiara and I work together in the Evidence for Policy Unit in the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science in Ireland. We have slightly different remits in our research section in the sense that I'm responsible for the national policy, a bit like Rian, around connecting policymakers across national government with the researchers in our public research system. And Chiara is going to talk a little bit about a case study on bringing researchers together with the policymakers in our own department to inform policy in the department itself. So just the first slide here, I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to give I don't know whether I have control of these slides. I don't think I do. Okay, thank you. Just to give a sense of this, there's a very strong willingness to support research evidence in policy making across Ireland at the moment. So it's built into a lot of our national policies, our programme for government, our civil service renewal strategy is the strategy for the civil service around innovation in the civil service, and evidence informed policy is one of the three core themes in that. The last one there is Creating Our Future was an exercise that one of our national funding agencies did, where we went out and we asked the public for their views around research and research priorities for government. And we had 18,000, or the National Funding Agency had 18,000 submissions from the public. And again, research informed policy and foresight in policy making came through very strongly. So it's not just at the national policy level, but also from the public. There's a strong interest in bringing evidence forward in policy. So the strategy Impact 2030 is the national research and innovation strategy, and I suppose that represents our department's view on this. So next slide, please. So this is one of the core themes, or one of the core pillars within the National Research and Innovation Strategy, is around maximising the impact of research and innovation. And I've highlighted there the particular area that I am working on, which is around strengthening the impact of the public research system on policy making. And our unit, the Evidence for Policy Unit, was established around the same time that the strategy came out, a little bit before it, but our unit was called out as being responsible for bringing the policy and higher education research sectors together, and to try and improve the research evidence input into policy responses to national challenges. So there was a number of other actions within that, within the strategy. It's the whole of the research innovation system strategy, but that's the piece that I'm focusing on, that I'll be talking about today. And I might just go to the next slide, if you don't mind. Thanks. So look, just to give a sense, so as I say, the Evidence for Policy Unit was established shortly before the National Strategy came out in May 2022. And the focus of my work in particular around the Evidence for Policy piece is around increasing data and evidence access for policymakers, improving the articulation of policy needs to the higher education research community, increasing evidence and also the capacity for evidence. So I think Rian mentioned this as well, around the civil service capacity to embed research evidence and the skills there, and also to increase capacity across the higher education system to ensure that there's actually the research expertise within the research system to respond and inform policy challenges. And also, I suppose, to create an understanding across both sides of the, I suppose, the challenges and how the systems operate, so that we can create these mutually beneficial partnerships. So what I have here on this slide is just to give you a sense of the evidence build that we have been engaged in so far. I should say that we are in the process, or in the throes of a general election here in Ireland, so I can't speak very specifically about the policy that we are working on, our actions, but I just wanted to, like I say, focus on the work that we are trying to do, and I suppose the areas, give a sense of the areas of focus for us. So I suppose an important piece of this is around creating an understanding of what's in the system already, what kind of research for policy activity is going on in the higher education research sector, and also what is going on our civil service side, our policy side, in terms of connecting with the research sector and how the systems work. So we established core structures there to try and inform us. So a key structure for us, and this is a permanent structure, is a civil service research network, which brings together research leads from across all government departments. We also have our National Statistics Agency in there, and our National Economic Evaluation Service as well. And the idea behind the Civil Service Research Network is it'll give departments a forum to share good practice in embedding research and policy, and also to try and bring together our research priorities and areas of commonality, so that when we go out to researchers, we're clear and coherent about the key areas for research needs and research engagement. We also had a higher education research for policy group, which was a group of higher education representatives. Our national funding agencies were involved there. And the idea there is that we wanted to have a sense of what was going on in the higher education sector already, because there's a lot of activity. It's just very disparate. So our higher education research representative bodies helped inform our approach there. We've since established on an informal basis a group of higher education research advocates from within the institutions themselves. And again, a bit like the Civil Service Research Network, is around sharing good practice and engaging with policy and trying to, I suppose, help the higher education research sector to understand how policy development works. We also had an open consultation, which we launched last year, which was targeting our higher education researchers and research institutions. And we went out and asked them how they are engaging with policy at the moment, what are the blockages to engaging with policy, and what do they think we should be doing to try and address these, or any suggestions or recommendations they have that might improve the partnerships and engagement going forward. So that was a hugely informative piece of work for us. The other thing we've been doing is we've been availing of these opportunities to engage in brokerage sessions and I suppose seminars and workshops, etc., to raise the profile of the work that we are doing. And we had our national funding agency usually on an annual basis organise a national research summit. So we spoke at those, and we had panel discussions there where we brought together researchers and policy practitioners to talk about their experiences of embedding research and policy engagement. We also had co-creation workshops earlier this year. Again, we wanted to bring policymakers and higher education researchers across all levels. We were trying to encourage early stage researchers as well as I suppose more experienced researchers to engage and really try and capture the expertise across the sector. So that was also very important in terms of informing us about an approach in the areas that we need to focus on to improve the relationships and to strengthen evidence in policy. So I suppose, again, these are the kind of areas that we're trying to focus on, or the areas that we're trying to target. So strengthening connectivity between and across the higher education research sector and the civil service communities, so and maximizing the impact of research, innovation and policy response. I suppose there are core goals. But as I mentioned, building capacity and broadening opportunities and competencies for engagement. So this will be around, I suppose, what can we do to help the everyday policymaker who's been given the challenge of creating a policy? How do they actually engage? How do they access evidence? What kind of evidence do they need to? How do they formulate research questions, etc.? But also on the higher education research side, how do we, I suppose, convey the complexity and messiness of policy making to the higher education research community, so that they understand that while research is important, there's many variables as well that need to be taken into account. And I suppose a key thing is around creating those clear pathways and structures for engagement, because what has been coming out is that people on both sides of the policy and higher education research community want to engage, but there's just no structures or pathways or networks for them to actually engage. So look, that's just to give a sense of the national approach. Chiara will take this forward a little bit to explain how one example of how our department in particular is trying to do this. Thank you.
So much. Slide, please. Hello, hi. As Eleonora mentioned, I lead in sectoral research, which means that I bring research relevant to further and higher education to the policy units. Today, I'm talking about a specific project that we are running, and this project involves the secondment of two researchers, Professor Brian Donnellan and Dr. Krishna Padlamannati, in our department on multi-annual basis. Our topic is assessing the impact of the tertiary system on innovation in the workplace. In plain English, the tertiary system can be conceived as the everything about post-secondary education, like further education and training, vocational training, higher education, research. So far, we know that research patenting is related to innovation. There is solid evidence. We don't know much about the rest, except for anecdotes, like people taking a course and innovating their role. But still, we don't know much. This is why we felt the need to bring researchers in. I could talk for hours about it. The organizer may not be that happy, so I will focus on two aspects. One is flexibility, and the other one is built-in engagement. Slide, please. In terms of flexibility, I mentioned our topic, assessing the impact of the tertiary system on innovation in the workplace. And that was something that was quite final for us. It was a bit non-negotiable. We weren't ready to change focus since it is very relevant to many units in our department. What we were really flexible about was the how part. Methodology, exact output, timeline, and so on. Like we were really open to negotiation. And that wasn't because we were particularly needy or in need of unholding and so much, but because we consider this secondment-based program as an exchange, and we really wanted to take on board the researchers' input, perspective, and skills on equal basis. It was not the traditional research project that you outsourced. Slide, please. About the built engagement, that is about how we made sure that findings were communicated to the policy units in a timely manner. We are talking about the tertiary system, how it impacts innovation in the workplace. It's something huge. It is relevant for our innovation division, for our higher education division, further education division. So all the relevant people had to be informed. In traditional projects, the research is done, an output, let's say a report is published, and then it is disseminated to policymakers. But of course, there are issues with that. Things that can become out of date very quickly. People may not have time at that time to look at the report. So many things can just get lost in the process. To avoid it, we decided to blend the barriers between doing research and disseminating it. And our approach was the governance structure. You can see that we have the researchers working in team, and then a steering board composed of the principal officers from all the relevant units. In this way, the principal officers, they could give their feedback and advice in timely manner that ensured that the research stayed relevant to the evolving policy landscape. At the same time, it ensured that policymakers, like the policy units, they learned about the research findings, including ad interim research findings as they were developed. So we like to look at that as a circle where dissemination, advice, and relationships, they're all part of the same cycle. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Leonora and Chiara. That was very informative and interesting. We have about 20 minutes left of the session, and I think we can take a good 15 minutes or so for question and answer. And I welcome my colleague from the OECD, Melissa Muthan, to moderate the discussion and question and answer session. So welcome to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Sonia. And good afternoon. Thank you to our 4 panelists. It was very interesting to hear about the perspectives and experiences from 4 different systems, but also interesting to see that there are common challenges and common themes in your presentations as well. I found that to be quite striking. My name is Melissa Muthan. I'm an analyst at the Education and Skills Directorate at the OECD, and I'll be leading this discussion. And so I encourage anyone in the audience, please do put your questions in the chat. We'd like this to be a lively discussion. We will pick up questions and put them to the panelists. So please, of course, do put your questions in the chat. So I suggest, firstly, I have a couple of questions of my own to put to the panel. And so I will start with that. So I would like to ask, how can we build a system in which policymakers actively demand evidence and in which this demand is met by accessible and systematic evidence? So in your view, what are the first steps to achieving this kind of systemic change? So if any of our panelists feel that they want to jump in on that question.
So I'd say that by doing it, I've noticed that it is really important to expose policymakers to research and to the benefit of research. I think the first time that we invited people to our steering board, half of them, they came out of courtesy, but then they realized that it was relevant and they kept coming back. Now there is more conversation about the need for research in the department. So my suggestion would be start somewhere and things will follow.
Also, maybe I can give what we're currently trying to do. We are currently organizing a workshop with Directorate. That is something that we are also currently testing, and if it's work, we will scale to other Directorate. And the idea is to bring Directorates that are implementing program in a workshop where they map the program at different stage of maturity. Then, for instance, they could have some ideas, then program that will start in the new year, for instance, order that are already implemented. Then we have categories like that. Then program at idea stage, at the stage of improving, at other stage to prove, other stage to adapt, etc. before scaling. And the idea that we have is to, when they map those programs, identify what type of information they need to move from one stage to another one, and then bring that information to the directors so that everyone knows that, okay, before this program could be scaled, we need, for instance, to assess if that's working. Then if I take the example of a new program, if they say it's at the idea stage, the basic information they need is to assess if there is a current need, then at least they need to do a need assessment. And then based on those information, we want to try, we are currently holding this workshop. And then if that work, we expect that we have in the ministry one directorate which is in charge of reform. And then we expect that, and we also bring this directorate inside this workshop, and then they will see how that's work. And if this replication is working, then they will institutionalize the process, and then making sure that now in the ministry, before moving from one stage to another one, at least there is some data that we identify to say, okay, the program is ready to go to the next stage, or we need to iterate new the program.
Can I just a quick point? I think one of the things we're finding in Ghana is that it's not really axiomatic that policymakers will gravitate towards evidence once you provide it. In fact, their work culture, we've realized the work culture is very important. There are a lot of competing things that come into their foray. And evidence is just one of them. So unless we deliberately create within the work culture avenues for them to be confronted with evidence as part of their processes of delivering their work, it would just be an interesting piece of information. So that is why in Ghana, we've created a high-level evidence committee. because that is within the ministry, bringing the various directors together, periodically being provided with data and evidence that speaks to an agenda that they have prioritized, and make it part and parcel of how that culture works. So I think it's back to the point that Andreas made. It is about a culture, creating a culture within which evidence becomes part of what policymakers do. Because if we put a lot of the emphasis on the infrastructure and produce the best evidence, there's no reason why they should gravitate towards that unless it fits into their, as part of their portfolio of things they need to do. That evidence becomes quite a relevant part of it. So that's why in Ghana, we deliberately created that within the ministry for them to periodically be confronted with data and evidence, and for them to have discussions about the significance, the implications for their work and for the districts.
Maybe I can add, no, I agree very much what has been said, but maybe I can add a few things, a few thoughts. I like the idea, and I think that that also resonates with what Kwame said. I like the idea of the Irish colleagues of having clear pathways. So it needs to be clear for a policymaker where he can find and where he can quickly find the evidence that he or she needs. I think for us also is important to show that relevant knowledge can be provided really quickly. There is this idea that it takes a lot of time if you want to acquire evidence. I think we have shown in our project, no, it can be done really quickly. You can get insights, relevant insights in a short period of time. And the last thing, and that also alludes to what Kwame already said. So my observation is that we spend a lot of time and give a lot of attention to programming research, to making agendas, but less time goes to speak about the results of the research and the results of evaluations. So what we are trying to create within the ministry is a kind of a full cycle of moving from, you have programmed this research, this is the results, what does that mean for your next round of research planning? So creating a kind of good cycle within the ministry, talking about not only the programming of research, but also the results of research.
Yeah, I think I would agree there with that point. I think that's very important, and indeed what Kwame was saying as well too. I think taking that a little bit further, I think, Rian, I agree with you that it's one thing to bring the research evidence and the policymaker together to be able to demonstrate the impact of that research and the outcomes of the research, I think is also really important. And I suppose one of the things that we have been able to do in Ireland through the structures that we've created, for example, like the Civil Service Research Network, because we're sharing our experiences across departments, we're showing each other how it can be done, and also showing to, I suppose, the impact of and where this research kind of hit home, if you like. So I think those structures, as Kwame was saying, is really important. Given those opportunities, and I suppose exposing case studies and examples of impact as well is also really helpful, I think, in terms of encouraging policymakers to engage with research.
Thank you. I think those are all excellent points. And I very much agree with what you were saying, Kwame, about it's very much about the culture. How can we create a culture of research use, evidence use in policy organizations? And as you were mentioning as well, of course, there's more of a tradition in academic institutions and universities for research production to be a slow process, but can we actually also expect research to be produced quickly? And it seems you're indicating that yes, that can be done. So those are very relevant points. I'd like to also ask, so what could be some of the key strategies for effectively collecting, categorizing, and using evidence to address the specific needs of different regions and grade levels?
I think, so
go ahead.
Sorry, I can give an example of an initiative that we have recently run. So as the Department for Further and Higher Education, we realized that we didn't really know what there was researching in areas relevant to us. So what we did was publishing a call for evidence, asking researchers active in areas relevant to us to basically come forward saying what they research about and why it is in line with our agenda. I think that it is a milestone in a longer journey, but at least like opening the communication with the researchers and first trying to identify who is out there, and second to signal openness. That is part, like I wouldn't say that is the solution, but it may be something to consider.
Yes, I think one of the things we found in Ghana is that when we ask teachers across the grades what their needs are as far as evidence that will improve their practice, we found that they were different, if depending on the grade the teacher you're talking to, but also depending on the district or the region. And often what we get in research evidence is a synthesis, or if you like, a summary of what the evidence is saying. So I think one thing that we've been encouraged to do is to make sure that when we collect data or evidence, that we disaggregate it and interrogate it in the disaggregation to understand the specific needs for why there may be differences. So the disaggregation of data. So for example, it should be possible for a director in a district to say, I want to know how boys are performing on this scale. And specific for that district, that data must be readily available. If there's some research that has been done in a particular region of the country, it has to be clear that this research is in reference to that region. Okay, and it should, and if it's applicable generally, it also has to be made clearer. So I think when we collect data, we have to pay attention to our audience, who our audience are, and understand what their needs are. And we cannot know that if we don't ask them. And I think that's the thing that researchers, the thing with researchers, because like I said, in Ghana, there's very good quality research about addressing the learning crisis. And yet when we talk to teachers, they tell us that they don't have evidence about how to address it, the learning crisis in their classrooms. Actually, they have access to some of that evidence, but they don't know how to reinterpret that evidence to inform their practice on the ground. So I think these are, information that we need to, when we collect the evidence, also to make sure that it is fit for the audience for which we are trying to target as we share that evidence. And it's a complex field that we need to embrace and find solutions to address as we move forward.
And if there are no other responses from the panelists, I would also like to invite the panelists, if you have questions for each other, please do feel free to jump in and put the questions to your fellow panelists. I do have another question. If we have a couple of more minutes, then I noticed that a couple of your presentations talked about that, for example, in Ghana, there are many more interventions, but there is still a lack of clarity of what works. And so I think this ties into the question of looking at impact of knowledge mobilization activities. So it remains challenging, for example, to measure the impact of partnerships between science and policy communities, between research and policy communities. What are some ways that we could measure impact for example, in relationship building between these communities? What are other ways that we can measure impact of these interventions?
Well, I suppose measuring impact is actually a very tricky thing to do, as we know, and particularly when you're looking at the impact of research. I suppose there's been a lot of countries that have tried to do this, but in terms of building partnerships, I suppose specific to the question, like I said, I think sharing of case studies has been really useful. When we went out and did our open consultation on the research for policy work, we asked our higher education research community to submit case studies of good examples of engagement and partnerships. So I think that they're, in terms of demonstrating impact, they've been really useful for us. And I suppose, like I said, I can't speak specifically to the policies that we're doing in the future, but one of the things I suppose we would like to do is figure out a way of showcasing these centrally so that these can be accessed by different people. But the other thing to say, just in terms of impact, and one of the things we've been trying to do is we are going to be looking at indicators as part of our work, and trying to figure out how we can capture the I suppose the outcomes from these partnerships. And what we have found useful is actually engaging in networks, and particularly national or international networks. You know, we're engaged in an MLE, for example, on Science for Policy, and it's been really helpful for us to actually discuss with our partner countries how they're going about, I suppose, developing their evidence ecosystems, but also capturing the impact of what's working and what's not working. So I don't know that it really answers your question about how to capture the impacts, but I think that engaging in those and learning from those networks has been very useful for us.
And maybe if I can add in, one of the things we found from teachers is that a lot of the impact evidence is actually confusing them. So you have studies that are, and particularly, I think this is probably a problem in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we have a lot of interest in interventions. So you do have studies which show here this thing works very well, and then you have another which says something else. And the teachers are telling us that we are getting these different messages, that this time we should use phonics, this is another approach is here and that. So although all of these studies are purporting to generate impact, they are actually, we are not looking at them across these impact interventions to say, what are they telling us and what should we be telling the policymaker or the teacher? And that is why in Ghana, we think that the high-level evidence committee would consider that comes in. And the repository would allow any organization that does research to deposit their evidence there and ensure that there's cost associated with the data, because often we don't have that to tell a policymaker that this thing works. When the policymaker is interested in scale, without providing, well, how much will it cost to actually implement this? You know, and a lot of the impact studies don't provide that data. And so we have made it very clear on the repository that please, when you deposit your research, make sure that you have some cost data. But it also sends a signal to those doing the research that we do need cost data for policymakers to be able to distinguish and say, okay, this costs $10, this costs $1. Here, given our resources, we'll go the $1. So we do need to also inform the research community what the policymakers would need to be able to make the kind of decisions we think they should be making to improve practice. And often, this is the point I think Andres and others have spoken about. There's a gap between the researchers, the research community, and the policymakers as to what they actually need. So impact has to be looked at very carefully to make sure that it's useful for the policymaker, but also for the teachers who are on the ground.
Yeah, and if I can also add a few words on it, I think I completely agree that measuring impact is something really difficult in that space. But I think we should also care about what we see, how the culture is changing, how we see people now more using more evidence. I think, and then I think for that we should, at the beginning of such initiative, think about our vision. What in the ideal world a process, a system with using evidence will look like, and then try to see how close we are to that, and see about how people, the culture, how people are using that evidence to decide, etc., etc. But it will be really difficult to measure that all those efforts that we are made are the ones who are providing the impact, but we should be mainly taking care about what we are currently seeing, how the system is currently improved, and based on that, identify the gaps that need to be filled, and then act accordingly. Yeah, I would say this is what I will add here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aziz. And as I'm conscious of time, I'm going to wrap up our discussion, but I think we can carry on this conversation offline and on separate platforms. I'm going to hand over to Sonia, who will close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to everyone, as well as our director at UNESCO and director at the OECD for their openings. I really welcome and I appreciate the presentations from all the colleagues. I have to say I learned a lot. At the same time, I also now have more questions. So I do hope we can continue these discussions offline, but also I hope we can continue these types of webinar series with our F1 learning series, which I'm sad to say this is the last one of 2024, although it is the end of the year. But we will have a new cycle in 2025, and we will be sharing information about this new cycle early in the new year. And I think this topic is a very interesting one, and I hope we can continue to discuss these issues around knowledge mobilization and brokering and building the partnerships between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. I think this is very important. And we can really learn a lot from each other while also taking account of how different the contexts are. So even within one context, we have to adapt many different ways depending on different school districts or populations. So I think we can learn a lot from each other, and I welcome everyone to join our next series of F1 learning webinars. Having said that, I also want to thank the OECD for collaborating in this last webinar of 2024, and hope we can continue to do so in 2025. Thank you, everyone. Oh, final point I wanted to say is that we will upload the links to the presentations and write a little synopsis about some key highlights of this session, and that will be posted on our website, and we will share with everyone, and hope that you will then also disseminate this to your networks so we can propagate what we've learned to others. So with that, I wish everyone a good day, and thanks again.